Hello, hello. I'm so happy to be back. Um, I am so sorry about the big delay. We did successfully move though, and our cats are safe, and we're safe, and we're all cozy, and we have a house that's full of house problems. That, you know how everybody warned you that when you get a house, it's really expensive? And you're like, it can't be that. It's expensive. Oh my goodness. So, anyway, that's neither here nor there. What I have for you today is a t shirt made from the pattern that Danny Choo provides for free. It's been requested a handful of times, and I thought it was time to come back with a bang and something that I know people actually want. So, without further ado, here we go. Hello, hi. I'm happy to be back. I finally have enough of a space where I can start recording again. I do not currently have a space where I can edit the recordings, but we'll get there. Until then, we have something that's been requested a few times. It is the t-shirt pattern that Danny Choo released for free. It is an excellent pattern. I have a variation of it where I do raise the neckline a little bit, specifically to make room for graphic images. But this will be the original because I assume that's what most people want to see and what they want to replicate. As a preface, I do want to let you know that I do my collars very differently. I have not figured out a way to make the collar look as absolutely gorgeous as the official merchandise using the method that I can only assume that they're using. So I kind of made up my own method instead. And you know, whether you prefer that or not, your mileage may vary, but I know a lot of people have asked me to show how I do it and how I get the results I get, and this is that way. So, without further ado, we are going to cut our pattern pieces. One thing to let you know when dealing with knits, and this is a stretchy knit for a t-shirt pattern, is you want to make sure that even though it's a knit, it still has a grain line. And you can actually, if you zoom in really, really close, which you might not be able to see on the camera, but there is teensy tiny little V's that make little rows. That's your front side. Your back side, depending on the kind of knit you're using, is usually a bunch of little bumpies. And the little bumpies go on the back. Basically, that's your purl side, if you know knitting terms. So you want to make sure that the V's are all facing upwards. So you want, and this is to ensure, because this is the most stretchy way the fabric goes, and you want that to go, you know, to stretch around the person's width, as opposed to, like, this way is still really stretchy because that's just the kind of knit it is, but it doesn't drape the right way. It doesn't hang as nice. So once you know how you want that, you set your pattern pieces up for cutting. And because they're doll things, I tend to do them in little chunks and try to conserve as much fabric as I can. These have been printed so that you cut them along the fold line, so you get two sides that are identical. And I like to fiddle with my fabric until I feel like I'm wasting the least amount, because who wants to waste fabric? It's expensive. You don't want to get your selvage in with your knit fabric though. I know you can fudge it sometimes, but I don't, especially with a selvage like this where it's very weird feeling. I don't like getting that in there. So then we just pin everything, and you know, when you're pinning, you want to make sure that your fold is even from top to bottom, which is kind of what I point out there, where you can, you know, if it's off by even a little bit, it can actually affect the fit of things at doll scale. So it's worth keeping an eye out for. And you can always flip your patterns upside down if it's more convenient for cutting. That is not a big deal. Especially since with a t-shirt pattern, you don't even have to like mark anything or anything like that. You can just
cut it out, no markings. You might also notice that I'm having the hardest time with these pins, and it is because they are brand new. I went out and got actually super thin ones, and they're lovely, but for whatever reason, I had to spin them between my fingers a little bit to get them to go through the fabric and the paper. Like, they just wouldn't do it otherwise. I don't know if it was like skin oils or what, but it was crazy. Every single new pin I picked up, I had to spin through my fingers just to get it to work. Once I did that, though, they're excellent, and I really like the super thin ones. Another thing is I sort of use the collar pattern as a base, but I do have the tendency to cut it a little wide, specifically because I like to have that little bit of extra room to work with in the seam allowance. And my collars can sometimes, if I overdo it, get a little on the chunky side, but I don't mind that look so much. So that's why that got cut a little bit differently than everything else. I know I've mentioned it in previous videos, but I do hold things up while I'm cutting the details, because if there's just a little bit of fabric like that, it doesn't warp it as much as if I tried to cut it flat on the table. And it just helps me get the most accurate cut, because again, the smallest thing will definitely affect stuff at doll scale.
Okay, so right sides out, we've ironed this in half. And then I start on the left-hand side, and with a little bit of overlap, I pin this. And then as I sew, I actually stretch this. And you can pre-do it. So you need your collar to be stretched just the tiniest bit, because you need it to pull in as it goes up. So like, if you don't stretch your collar at all, the end that you get is a collar that stands up straight, which is a good look for some things, but definitely not for t-shirts. Like, your collar will just sit perpendicular. So you stretch it a little so that it pulls it flat along this edge. And that is the trick to a nice collar, and unfortunately, it's tricky, and it just takes practice. Part of why I like doing the collar bit first is because you don't have an entire shirt that you're going to ruin, because ripping stitches out of knits is a pain and tends to damage the knit. So, how do you know how much to stretch it? Is a good question, because it's dependent on your fabric. Different fabrics, different fabric weights, if you're using ribbed versus just more of the same of the t-shirt, all is going to affect how stretchy it needs to be. And you're just going to have to get a feel for it if you want to be making a lot of t-shirts. I will. I tend to lay it like that and then pull it a little bit until it just, I don't even know how to say it. You get a feel for it, you know, okay, that seems like it's about enough. And then I pin that, and when I'm going through the machine, I want the top layer to stretch and I want the bottom layer not to stretch. Two ways of doing that. One, the cheap way, is to use some kind of paper or tissue as a back, like a pin it pin everything down to that stabilizer. The other way is to get a walking foot, and walking feet are kind of expensive. So I will be using a walking foot because I love it and it's my baby, but that is not the best option for everybody.
You might have noticed that I am using just an awful lot of pins, and I don't always. Sometimes it's just to do with mood, sometimes, like in this case, I kind of wanted to test out these new pins, and yeah, it's definitely a very good way to get more precision if that's something that you have trouble with while you're sitting at the machine pushing stuff through, because that's a lot to think about all at once. And I think pins sort of alleviate that. You know, you're not having to think about everything. You've got your pins sort of holding things in place as you go. And just stitch that guy down along that curve. And then we move on to the front side. And I think I cut out some footage of me trimming the back because, quite frankly, I massacred the back. You'll see later in the video. It's bad. But moving on here, the front is done kind of the same way as the back. And you do want to pay special attention to where the very center of your front ends up though, because we do have a V-neck. And then along the sides, you just keep the collar stretched a little bit with the t-shirt itself not stretched, and pin her down. And you might have noticed my one pin is a little bit different than the others. That's because that is the center front, and I want to know where that is while I go through the machine, because that's where we're going to pivot it. And I thought you might be interested, especially with something this fiddly and this kind of delicate, to see exactly how slow you go. Because, like, I am pretty experienced in doing this. I have made a few t-shirts at this point, and this is how fast I go. Like, I speed up my clips, obviously, because this is extremely boring and fiddly, and, like, you can see me here just trying to get my machine to not snag. Like, it was snagged on something, I don't know what. So I used a pin to get it unsnagged, and then we stitch, and we go very slow. Even with the walking foot, it is absolutely worth slowing down to get this stuff, because, you know, the collar and the neckline are what people are going to be looking at for sure. When we get to our center pin, I put my needle down, pull my foot up, readjust, and then keep on going. It is always good practice to take your pins out while you're sewing. If I'm going super, super slow, sometimes I don't do that. Really though, do as I say, not as I do. It's much better to take those pins out. I actually did have one break once while I was using an industrial machine in college, and the needle shard hit me an inch under my eye, and I about had a heart attack. Do not recommend, especially with those industrial machines. They're terrifying. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. What we're doing next on the t-shirt is folding it in half with the right sides facing so that you get that little collar piece to stick out. And then you're going to sew just along that needle line, and you'll basically be making a little triangle. This is what's going to make the collar have the V-neck, and it looks really slick. I recommend sewing over that multiple times because it is going to have some tension on it, so you don't want that to unravel. If you're not comfortable using a sewing machine to do such a teeny tiny seam, it is more than acceptable to hand sew it. Just, again, go over it more than once because you're going to want that extra security. So you are going to want to snip the seam allowance of the t-shirt material just straight towards the V without going over, and that'll help release the tension and help your collar lay flatter, as well as trim down the seam allowance within the collar as well.
And I'm mad because I forgot on this one that a lot of times when I trim super close to the seam, I only need to trim that very, very top one because it tends to curl out. This middle piece tends to curl that way, so like back towards the shirt, which is not nearly such an obnoxious thing to do. So I trim this little guy super, super close, millimeter from the edge, but I leave these ones just a tiny bit longer, and I think that is a more stable and better option. I can't believe I didn't remember that over here, where now everything wants to curl out because it's mean.
Then we are going to pin the shoulder seams, and the thing you want to make sure you're doing with the shoulder seams is if you left a little bit of extra collar sticking out, that is not what you're lining up. You're lining up the actual t-shirt material. And I'm also going to hem my sleeves while they're flat because it is infinitely easier. I don't know if you notice it, but my walking foot has just this one spot that likes to catch, and so like a half inch into my sewing I have to pick it up and let it drop again, otherwise it will get super mad and crunch up and look bad. So get to know your equipment, because sometimes you just have little quirks like that that you need to work around. Uh-oh, I'm getting fussed at by a cat. Did you hear him? Oh no. And while I go, I do sometimes trim away the extra seam bulk, and I like to use tiny little diagonal cuts to cut as much of that extra bulk out as I can, because that is the enemy, while also not messing up the stitching line that I just sewed. So then we put our sleeves on, and this is pretty much the same story as every other sleeve we've done on this channel. You make your side seams line up on both sides, and then match your center up to the shoulder seam. One thing to keep in mind is that if you're sewing for humans, and maybe some dolls, I haven't seen it as much with dolls, but especially for humans, sometimes the front isn't the same length as the back. And that's totally normal for people, because people are very, extremely varied and have different shapes. Whereas dolls tend to be a man-made item that we like symmetry, so we put symmetry into dolls that is not actually in people. So it's just kind of an interesting cheat that you can get away with this for dolls, but if you're working for a person, you don't want to just assume that the middle of the sleeve is going to be the sleeve cap, because it's not. We are going to stitch up those sleeves, and again, like all fiddly things, go slow, readjust while you're sewing, make sure your needle is down while you're readjusting, because it'll save you a lot of heartache later. And then we trim out all of the excess bulk, which I definitely like to do as I'm going, because otherwise it's hard to access, if not impossible. Next up, we are going to stitch the side seams. You will want to make sure that the underarm seams line up nicely, and I do have them pointed towards the sleeve, which is just kind of best practice. even when sewing for people and not dolls. These patterns are designed specifically with the back piece being just slightly narrower than the front piece. That's definitely by design. It pushes the side seams just a little bit towards the back, and it's subtle enough that it's really not noticeable unless you're literally sewing it together like this. It's, I think, really clever because it just makes the side seams a little bit less obnoxious and in your face when you're photographying. Oh my goodness. When you're photographing the doll from the front. And whether or not you want to start from the bottom and work up, or if you want to start from the sleeve and work down, is kind of personal preference. I have found that it's easier to line up the ends of the sleeve, which is what really matters the most in this case, with the sewing machine by starting at the sleeve. However, if I'm working with a serger, it's easier to go the other way. I'm not sure why that is, if it's just me or what, but go figure. After the side seams have been sewn, we are going to stitch the hemline, and if you're worried about making your hemline a little bit wonky or lopsided, you can always pin it up, and that just kind of gives you a better idea. You know, I only put 4 pins in and they were enough, but if you want 8 or even more, it's totally whatever makes this part easier for you. Now you want to pay close attention to how I have this set up. I am not trying to wrap the shirt around any part of my machine to sew this because that will make it stretch, and you do not want it to stretch.
And there you have it. It ends up fitting quite nicely. This is the medium smooth bust, and it could easily go up to the large. There's plenty of stretch in this material. You can see I did do that a little bit too tightly. There's just the tiniest bit of waver. Not too bad though. And my biggest regret is not flipping over to the twin needles, because these, even with tiny stitches, have no stretch at all. I thought the tiny stitches might help. They don't. So it is a little bit trickier, and honestly, if you did the twin needles, it would be even easier to do over big busts because you'd be able to stretch this way more. Whereas this doesn't want to stretch at all. But up here, it stretches just fine. So, yep, definitely biggest regret, twin needles, don't be lazy. Otherwise though, she looks excellent.
And there you have it. I'm super pleased with how this one turned out, though frankly it is hard to go wrong when your base pattern is so excellent. For real. You can do so many things with this. I do tend to raise the collar line to add images to the shirt, but really you wouldn't necessarily need to. Like, it looks just fine as is. You could put a cute image on there if you wanted to. There's just so many different things you can do with a good t-shirt pattern. I hope this helps if you want to make one yourself, and if you like this kind of thing, definitely please subscribe and give me a thumbs up and a like. It really helps. I'm glad to be back. I plan to do more soon, and I will see you again later. Bye bye.